Imagine for a moment that you're stepping into the shoes of a top-tier security analyst.
Right, like right in the thick of it.
Exactly. You're sitting in this secure room, screens are glowing everywhere, and you're watching a highly sophisticated, multi-layered state apparatus literally fight for its absolute survival in real time.
It is a pretty intense scenario to put yourself in.
It really is. Because you aren't just looking at, troop movements or supply lines. You're watching a war over reality itself. And today we are opening up the raw intelligence of that exact war.
Yeah, we're looking at a really dense stack of unclassified intelligence reports, geopolitical analyses, and some academic research.
Right, all covering the unprecedented 2025 to 2026 Iranian protests. And I want to be super clear right up front. We aren't here to take a political side.
No, definitely not.
Not left, not right, not the U.S., Israel, or Iran. Our mission for this deep dive is strictly to impartially report what's in these sources and decode the playbooks.
Exactly. We are conducting a comparative analysis of military behavior and information warfare. So placing the 1979 Islamic Revolution side by side with the 2026 regime collapse scenario to see exactly how authoritarian survival works.
Which is, it's a chilling vantage point to adopt.
It is, but it's absolutely necessary if you want to understand modern statecraft. You're essentially watching the mechanics of regime survival pushed to their absolute limits. We're stripping away all the rhetoric to just look at the how and the why of rebellion and suppression.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because if we want to understand how a regime survives a massive uprising today, well, we first have to understand how it controls the flow of information.
Right. And the battlefield has changed so drastically since 1979. It almost looks like a different planet.
Oh, entirely. The contrast is just staggering. The 1979 playbook was remarkably low-tech, but, completely devastating to the establishment.
Yeah, Ayatollah Khomeini supporters essentially built a physical peer-to-peer network using audio cassettes.
Audio cassettes, it's just wild.
Right. These tapes were smuggled in from Najaf, Iraq, recorded in makeshift underground studios, and then distributed through incredibly mundane channels.
Like music stores, right?
Exactly. You would go to a music store in Tehran, buy a regular album, and the shopkeeper would quietly slip one of these revolutionary speeches right into your bag.
Wow. And alongside those cassettes, you had the LMI, which were basically photocopied open letters and pamphlets.
Yeah, just paper and tape, essentially.
Right. And the reason this low-tech approach was so lethal is because of how the Shah's regime tried to fight it. The Shah relied on this very clumsy top-down censorship.
He controlled the television broadcasts and the print newspapers.
Yeah, but centralized censorship is practically useless against an untraceable, decentralized network that's just moving hand-to-hand through mosques and bazaars. You can't shut down a broadcasting tower if the broadcast is a literal cassette tape in someone's pocket.
You really can't. And that physical network created something analysts call ideological certainty.
Ideological certainty. What does that mean in practice?
Well, because the information channels were limited but highly trusted, the messaging remained incredibly focused. The pamphlets and cassettes created this single driving narrative that brought all these disparate, often conflicting societal groups together under one unified banner.
With one clearly defined enemy.
Exactly.
But then, we fast forward to the 2025 and 2026 protests. The spark is completely different. It starts over a collapsing currency.
Right, an economic trigger.
Yeah. And the regime's response to the spread of information is fundamentally different, too. They don't just pull the plug on the internet to cause a total blackout like they did in 2019 or 2022.
No, they use a far more insidious tactic, which the sources call protocol-level sabotage.
Protocol-level sabotage, that sounds...
It's a crucial evolution in state censorship. Instead of severing the connection, which, often just enrages the public further and draws all this international condemnation, the regime degrades the internet's core functions.
Like specifically the plumbing of the internet.
Yeah, the intelligence reports specifically highlight how they targeted the domain name system, or DNS, and deliberately disrupted transport layer security, the TLS handshakes.
Okay, let's break down how that actually feels to a normal user on the ground. If the internet is a highway system, they aren't blowing up the roads.
Right, they're just messing with the traffic.
Exactly. They are basically just randomly removing the exit signs. That's the DNS disruption, so your browser literally doesn't know where to go.
Yeah.
And they are stopping every single delivery truck to meticulously check its manifest. That's the TLS handshake interference.
Which completely stalls out secure connections.
Right. So it makes the commute so agonizingly slow that people just give up and stay home. So instead of locking the library doors, they just rearranged all the books and turned off the lights so you get too exhausted to find what you're looking for.
That is the perfect visualization of the mechanism. Devices still appear to be online. You know, your phone shows a strong Wi-Fi or cellular signal.
But nothing actually loads.
Exactly. Secure websites just time out, encrypted messaging apps stall endlessly on connecting, and the VPNs that citizens usually rely on completely collapse under the friction.
Which induces this massive wave of what the analysts call digital fatigue.
Digital fatigue, yeah.
Because if the internet is just painfully, inexplicably broken, a user is, far more likely to blame their own aging device or their local service provider,
rather than recognizing it as a highly coordinated, deliberate act of state sabotage. It exhausts the population before they even step out into the street. What's fascinating here is the epistemic paradox this creates.
The epistemic paradox. Walk me through that.
So when you read the academic research comparing 1979 to the 2026 scenario, this striking contradiction emerges. Today's Iranian society is actually deeply saturated with information.
Right, even with the throttling.
Even with the protocol throttling, citizens have access to satellite television, Starlink terminals, encrypted apps, and decentralized citizen journalism.
So there's no shortage of data.
None. In many ways, the crowds on the streets in 2026 are epistemically healthier than the crowds of 1979. They can clearly see the economic breakdown, and they can judge the regime's failures independently without having to rely on state media.
Wait, I really want to sit with this for a second, because we constantly assume that more information equals more freedom, right?
That's the standard assumption, yeah.
Are the analysts saying that the very tools we think of as liberating, like this massive abundance of digital information, actually protected the regime because it shattered the public's focus?
That is precisely what the data suggests. Because there is just so much competing information, so many different factions, and so many conflicting narratives circulating simultaneously, the opposition lacks that unified, coordinated force that existed in 1979.
Wow, so information spreads much faster than physical organization.
Exactly. In 1979, the limited bandwidth of those cassettes forced everyone onto the exact same page. Today, plurality survives the censorship, but that very plurality makes it incredibly difficult to coalesce into a single, decisive political force capable of toppling the state apparatus.
That is a brilliant, totally counterintuitive insight. But, paralyzing the domestic internet and relying on digital fatigue is really only half the battle.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if you create an information vacuum by slowing the network to a crawl, well, you have to fill that vacuum with your own reality.
You have to control the narrative.
Right. And the security analysts tracking the regime's official Telegram channels and state media broadcasts identified this highly structured four-phase playbook for narrative control during these protests.
Tracking these four phases really reveals the exact anatomy of how a modern state manages a severe crisis of legitimacy.
So phase one begins in December 2025, when protests first broke out in the Tehran Bazaar over the collapsing value of the reality.
And phase one is characterized by partial recognition.
Right, the supreme leader gave this highly publicized speech where he actually acknowledged the economic grievances of the shopkeepers.
He validated their anger over the currency crisis.
He did. But in the exact same breath, he claimed that violent mercenaries were hiding among the legitimate, economically anxious protesters.
Which is a masterful wedge tactic, if you think about it. By validating the economic pain, the state avoids completely alienating the working class or the traditional bazaar merchants.
Right, they say, we hear you.
Exactly. But by instantly introducing this shadow group of mercenaries, they criminalize the political dissent. They create this scenario where you can be angry about your wallet, but if you chant against the state, you are suddenly grouped in with violent infiltrators.
And they didn't keep those infiltrators vague for long either. By January 2026, the sources show the regime shifting aggressively into phase two, which is the foreign agent narrative.
The vague mercenaries from December explicitly became the United States and Israel by January.
Yeah, the regime started using terms like Zionist terrorists and claimed foreign intelligence agencies were manipulating innocent Iranian youth.
And the state media apparatus went into absolute overdrive to legitimize this claim. They began broadcasting supposed confessions of captured spies.
Right, and displaying caches of seized weapons on national television.
The psychological goal here is to just lower the threshold for state violence, because if a member of the besieged paramilitary is told to shoot an angry local shopkeeper, they might hesitate.
Of course.
But if they are convinced they are shooting a foreign-backed terrorist trying to destroy the entire nation, that hesitation completely vanishes.
Which unfortunately paves the way for the brutal crackdowns that followed. But then, while the protests were still actively simmering in various provinces, the regime executes Phase 3.
The victory narrative.
Yeah, they prematurely declared a historic, definitive victory over the plots of foreign enemies.
They bust thousands of people into city centers for these massive pro-regime rallies, waving flags to basically project an image of a unified nation that had successfully thwarted a foreign conspiracy.
Even though the protests were still happening.
Exactly. This is all about dominating the visual landscape. Even if localized protests are still going on, the state floods the airwaves with images of stability and triumph.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Phase 4. Just as they declared total victory over the civil unrest, the regime completely reframes the narrative again.
We do a total pivot.
Yeah, they stop treating the protests as a resolved domestic issue and start framing them as a direct continuation of the 12-day war. And just for context for you listening, the sources detail a massive, highly destructive regional conflict involving Israel and the U.S. that had occurred in June 2025, just a few months prior.
So claiming a domestic victory in Phase 3 while declaring an ongoing existential war in Phase 4 might sound like a massive contradiction to an outside observer.
It sounds completely disjointed. I mean, how do you tell your citizens, we won, everything is fine, the protests are over, and then immediately say, we are currently fighting for our lives in a regional war? From a psychological warfare standpoint, isn't that just going to confuse the population?
It isn't meant to make logical sense. It is meant to force a population into a corner. By framing civil unrest as an active national security crisis, like an extension of a military war, you force the public into a survival mindset.
I see.
You make them feel victorious, but perpetually unsafe. The underlying message is, we defeated the immediate protest plot, but we are still under siege from the outside, and any future internal dissent is treason.
Wow. So it legally and morally justifies martial law, future arrests, and basically a permanent state of emergency.
It completely changes the rules of engagement for the citizens.
It really does. But everything we've talked about so far, the protocol sabotage, the 4-phase narrative playbook, that is all targeted at the people living inside Iran's borders.
Yes, the domestic front.
And what the intelligence reports make painstakingly clear is that the regime is simultaneously fighting a totally different information war aimed at the rest of the world.
The dual information war. Managing an isolated domestic population is an entirely different beast from managing the state's image on the global stage.
Think about the vacuum created when a country goes dark. If the domestic internet is broken, who is telling the story of these protests to the West?
The regime fills that void themselves. They use English and Hebrew language telegram channels, as well as state-sponsored networks like Press TV.
Right. And their goal internationally isn't to justify crackdowns to their citizens. It is to project strength and exploit the internal divisions of their adversaries.
We see very clear examples of psychological warfare tactics deployed across borders. Like during the height of the 2026 crisis, the regime's cyber apparatus sent threatening SMS messages directly to the personal phones of Israeli citizens.
That is wild. What did they say?
These messages contain cryptic, menacing phrases like, "Look to the sky at midnight."
Which has absolutely no military value, but immense psychological value. It's strictly designed to instill pure anxiety in the civilian population of a rival state.
Precisely. And they simultaneously flooded Hebrew language social media channels with narratives claiming that Israel's economy was failing, its society was hopelessly fragmented, and its leadership was totally corrupt.
So the strategic goal is to project this mirror image. Like, while Iran is supposedly unified and victorious over its unrest, its enemies are the ones truly on the verge of systemic collapse.
That's the exact playbook.
And the regime applies a highly specific version of this to the United States using what analysts call the hypocrisy narrative.
Yes, the hypocrisy narrative.
The sources show Iranian state media heavily amplifying footage of anti-IC protests and police clashes happening in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The regime broadcasted this footage globally with a very pointed message.
Essentially saying, How can the U.S. president claim to support the human rights of Iranian protesters when he has Iranian blood on his hands from the recent 12-day war and is currently deploying police against his own citizens in Minneapolis?
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals a profound vulnerability in how international audiences consume digital signals from authoritarian states.
Because Western audiences frequently mistake outward-facing state broadcasts for organic domestic reality, we saw this exact same misconception play out during the 2009 Green Movement.
Oh, the so-called Twitter revolution.
Exactly. Think about how often you see a trending hashtag and just naturally assume it represents the reality on the ground for everyday people in a conflict zone. That's exactly the trap the intelligence shows Western media fell into back in 2009.
Western commentators enthusiastically dubbed the 2009 protests the Twitter revolution, operating under the totally false belief that regular Iranians were using Twitter to organize protests in the streets of Tehran.
But the data analysis showed that almost no one inside Iran was actually using Twitter for domestic organization at that time.
It was an outward-facing broadcast. It was the English-speaking elites, the diaspora, and political actors using the platform to try and influence the international community's perception of the events.
And today, in 2026, the regime has fully weaponized this dynamic. They manage two distinct, heavily manicured realities.
Right. They maintain an environment of strict, brutal security and informational darkness for their domestic citizens,
while simultaneously broadcasting a highly curated narrative of anti-imperialist defiance, stability, and Western hypocrisy for the global timeline.
So they are curating the timeline for the West while literally throttling the internet for their own people.
Exactly.
But, as sophisticated as this narrative control and protocol sabotage might be, propaganda can ultimately only buy dying regime time. As the security analysts point out in these reports, long-term state survival always comes down to the physical architecture of coercion.
The guys with the guns.
The guys with the guns.
The physical military matrix. You really cannot accurately model a regime collapse scenario without analyzing the institutions of force that underpin the state.
And this brings us back to our comparison between 1979 and 2026, because the contrast in military architecture is just stark.
Very stark. In 1979, the Shah's entire regime rested almost exclusively on a single pillar, which was the regular armed forces known as the Artesh.
And the Artesh was a highly centralized professional military. And crucially, it was non-ideological.
Right. Their primary loyalty was to the institution of the military itself, not necessarily the divine right of the monarchy.
So when the protests swelled to millions of people and the costs of repressing the population became just too steep, the Artesh made a calculated decision.
They simply declared neutrality. They ordered their troops back to the barracks.
And the moment they stepped back, the Shah's regime collapsed instantly. It was a clean, unitary collapse.
But the architects of the Islamic Republic studied that failure very closely. They understood that relying on a single professional military was a fatal vulnerability.
So they designed a parallel, overlapping security apparatus to ensure that a simple declaration of neutrality would never be enough to topple the government.
Today, the state does not just rely on the Artesh. You have the regular army, sure, but you also have the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and you have the Bashish,
which is a vast paramilitary volunteer force embedded in literally every neighborhood and university.
Yes.
We have to dig into the mechanics of the IRGC, though, because the economic analysis in these sources paints a fascinating picture. The IRGC isn't just an ideological army with advanced weaponry.
Far from it.
They are an economic behemoth. They control more than 50% of Iran's entire GDP through what analysts call a military boneyard complex.
Yeah, and to understand a boneyard, think of it as a massive tax-exempt charitable trust that essentially functions as a corporate conglomerate.
Like a megacorporation.
Exactly. We are talking about organizations that own massive construction companies, telecommunications networks, shipping ports, and petrochemical plants. The Revolutionary Guard doesn't just protect the state. They functionally own the state's most lucrative assets.
Which completely changes their incentive structure.
Completely.
Because an IRGC commander isn't just defending a theological concept anymore. He is defending his own massive wealth, his factories, his import-export monopolies. Their financial survival is inextricably tied to the survival of the regime.
So they can't just declare neutrality and go back to the barracks like the army did in 1979, because if the regime falls, they lose all of their wealth and likely face prosecution.
And this brings us to the core of the security analyst's viewpoint on regime stability. Because of this deeply entrenched parallel structure, the regime utilizes what military strategists call a mosaic defense.
A mosaic defense.
Yeah, how does that actually function on the ground during a crisis?
Well, it is a highly decentralized command structure designed specifically to survive decapitation strikes. For example, the intelligence scenarios model what happens if top leadership, like the supreme leader, is eliminated. In a highly centralized system like the Shah's, cutting off the head causes the body to die, orders stop flowing, and the military paralyzes.
Makes sense.
But in a mosaic defense, operational capability is widely distributed across regional networks.
So if the center goes dark or communication lines are severed, the local commanders already have the authority, the weapons caches, and the economic resources to continue suppressing dissent independently.
Exactly. The limbs can keep fighting even if the head is removed.
So what does this all mean? Does a decentralized, economically entrenched army utilizing a mosaic defense make the regime completely invincible to an uprising?
No, it does not make them invincible. But it drastically changes the nature of how they would fall. It makes them incredibly resilient to a swift, clean 1979-style collapse.
Right.
The analysts conclude that if the 2026 regime falls, it will not be because of a sudden, peaceful transition of power brought on by military neutrality. It will be a messy, asymmetric fragmentation.
Because the state is so deeply embedded in every layer of society and the economy, tearing it out threatens to tear the whole country apart.
Yes, if the central authority weakens, the regular army might try to act as a stabilizing force. But simultaneously, you have marginalized ethnic groups like the Baloch and the Kurds who have their own armed factions and historical grievances.
And if those IRGC commanders sense the end is near, that decentralized mosaic structure could fracture into competing warlord factions fighting to protect their own economic fiefdoms.
It is the ultimate grim insurance policy for an authoritarian state, making your own destruction so costly and so chaotic that even your fiercest domestic enemies hesitate to pull the trigger.
Let's recap the incredible journey we've taken today. We started by observing the stark evolution of information warfare, moving from the physical underground cassette networks that created ideological certainty in 1979 to the highly sophisticated protocol-sabotaging digital fatigue of 2026.
Right, and we decoded the regime's 4 phases of narrative control.
Watching them pivot from acknowledging economic pain to blaming foreign agents, declaring premature victory, and finally psychologically cornering their citizens by framing protests as a continuation of an existential war.
We also explored how international audiences are manipulated through a dual information strategy. Utilizing psychological threats via SMS and highlighting Western hypocrisy to project strength abroad while imposing an information vacuum at home.
And finally, we looked at the physical architecture of coercion. We detailed exactly why the regime's parallel military structure, the IRGC's massive corporate grip on the economy, and the decentralized mosaic defense make a clean revolution incredibly difficult to achieve today.
Which leaves us with a profound and frankly chilling concept borrowed from the theories of revolution we reviewed in the academic sources.
What's that?
Well, history shows that successful revolutions typically require 3 ingredients: a severe state crisis, a fracture among the elite, and mass mobilization of the public. But what happens if all 3 of those conditions are met? Yet the state is so deeply entrenched in the economy and the military that its collapse doesn't liberate the country, but instead shatters it into a decentralized, multifactional war zone.
It is a terrifying prospect.
It raises an important question for anyone studying these movements. Does the ultimate success of the resistance depend not on defeating the regime's enforcers in the streets, but on somehow coaxing those economic and military elites to defect before the entire structure burns down around them?
A massive question, and just a lot to think about. Next time you see a trending hashtag or a breaking headline about unrest, remember the analyst's scream. Think about the unseen battles over internet protocols, the carefully timed psychological narratives, and the overlapping military structures fighting in the dark. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you see on the global stage, and we'll see you next time.